Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our information session on the electric vehicle charging program, and thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Calvin, and I am the program lead for energy efficiency programs here at the Municipal Climate Change Action Center, and I will be the host for this information session. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Microphones are muted and all cameras are turned off. Please submit any of the questions that you have through the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar. My colleague Kara will be moderating the chat throughout, and the most upvoted questions will be prioritized. So if anyone has kind of a similar question to you, you can just upvote that question rather than typing it in yourself. Note that this session will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel within a few days if you want to go back and review anything that you may have missed. So before starting, we just want to acknowledge that this presentation is being delivered from Treaty 6 territory and acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant communities. For those of you who are not familiar with the Action Centre, we were established in 2009 as a collaborative initiative between the Alberta municipalities, or formerly the AUMA, the rural municipalities of Alberta, and the government of Alberta. And the Action Centre provides funding, technical assistance, and education to Alberta's municipalities, nonprofits, and schools to help them in addressing climate change. So since 2009, we've managed a variety of programs and initiatives that have made a pretty significant impact throughout Alberta, including working with 387 unique organizations to complete 739 projects that ended up catalyzing $73.5 million in clean energy investments. You can see some of the other results from our work on the slide there as well. As for the agenda for today's information session, well, we're just going to go over some EV charging 101, just make sure that everyone understands kind of the lingo and we're all speaking the same language as to the different types of stations and power outputs and plugs and so forth. So a little bit of knowledge building there. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the actual program itself, starting with the program objectives, the funding structure, the eligibility in terms of project types and expenses, the participation timeline, a few tools and resources we have available on our website, and wrap up with the Q&A. So diving into it with EV Charging 101, I wanted to just cover the three core charging levels particular to passenger vehicles. So if we start on the left-hand side there, looking at level 1 charging, that's really the slowest charge option that uses a standard electrical outlet. And this plug will generally come with each new EV and is portable, typically stored in the trunk of a EV, and is generally only intended for emergency use only because it is such a slow charge. And level 1 stations are not eligible for the EVCP program because obviously they come with the purchase of EVs. Next, into the middle, we have our level 2 charging stations. This is the medium charge option that can generally add 25 to 45 kilometers per charge. And level 2 stations are great for top-ups whenever a vehicle is parked at a location for more than 1 hour or 1 hour or so, and are also really great for overnight charging. So in a municipal context, level 2 stations are great options at recreation centers, community halls, tourist attractions, libraries, downtown cores, or on-street locations. really anywhere that would encourage residents and or visitors to spend an hour or two enjoying those local amenities while their vehicle is charging. And level 2 stations are eligible for EVCP, and we'll get into some of those details throughout the information session. And lastly are the level 3 stations. You may also see these referred to as DC fast charging stations or DCFCs. And these are the fastest charging options that generally will charge a vehicle's batteries up to about 80% in as little as 30 minutes and are best suited for long distance travel. Site selection is particularly important for level 3 stations because, again, you want to ensure close proximity to amenities because there is still that 20, 30, in some cases 40-minute wait. So you want people to have an option to go off, grab a bite to eat, or enjoy a local trail or something like that. But site selection is also really important for level 3 because level 3 stations will require phase 3 power. So you may or may not have phase 3 power at all of your intended sites. Moving over to the plug types. So there's a variety of plug types used by EVs, but these are really the four kind of core varieties. So the most common is the J1772 connector on the left-hand side. This charges on level 1 and level 2 voltages and speeds and is used by all EVs. Next is the CHAdeMO connector, which is only level 3 and is actually used primarily by Japanese-made electric vehicles. Third is the combined charge system, or CCS, which you may notice just expands on the J1772 shape with 2 extra conductors and is used for level 3 and primarily by American and European-made EVs. And finally, Tesla's proprietary connector shape is on the far right-hand side and is used for all level 1, 2, and 3. And Teslas can use all plug types, but they will require specialized adapters to use the different plug types, which do not come with the vehicle, although they may have made a recent change that the J1772 connector may come with Teslas, but the CHAdeMO and the CCS adapters would require a separate purchase. So getting into the program objectives. So we generally have 4 core objectives with this program, starting at the top to really develop the EV charging network across Alberta and reduce gaps between locations. If any of you have spent any time on the plugshare.com charging map, and particularly look at Alberta compared to other provinces, you'll see that there's pretty significant gaps between locations. Particular areas are west, north, and east of Edmonton, but also along other major highways and in the southeast corner of the province as well. We're also looking to build awareness and contribute to accelerating the adoption of EVs in Alberta and overall supporting Canada's target of 100% zero-emission vehicle sales by 2035. And just more visibility of stations and so forth will really help people adopt the technology in Alberta. We're also looking to support the availability of public EV charging stations through this program for residents who may not have access to home charging. So if someone lives in a basement suite or a multi-unit residential building that does not have a garage or even an outlet to charge on level 1, more public stations will give them options to at least at a bare minimum consider an EV for their next vehicle. And finally, provide options for municipalities to future-proof their own fleet operations by building up charging infrastructure for municipal fleet use. And even that coincides with our other program, the Electric Vehicles for Municipalities program, where you can receive rebates for the purchase of passenger vehicles, low-speed vehicles, and medium heavy-duty vehicles for municipal fleets. Getting into the funding structure, starting at the top for networked level 2 stations, we will cover 100% of the install and equipment costs, and we'll get into those, what else is included in those eligible expenses on a later slide, to a maximum of $10,000 per connector. So you'll notice that the level 2 rebate is a little bit different than the others in that it's per connector rather than per station. And this is due to level 2 stations having dual connectors, some of them. You can get single connector level 2 stations and dual connector level 2 stations. So if a municipality was to pursue a dual connector station, you can actually receive up to $20,000 because there's 2 connectors. And then the rebate really is tiered based on the power output for level 3 stations. So as we go up in power output, our rebate goes up to accommodate the additional costs that are associated with that infrastructure, ranging from $30,000 as a maximum on the low end to $150,000 on the high end. And across the total the program overall, municipalities can receive a maximum of $200,000, regardless of the size. So that's the case for the Red Deers, Edmontons, and Calgarys, but also the smaller towns and villages as well. And this funding is sourced from the Government of Alberta at 50% and Natural Resources Canada at 50%, and will be distributed on a first-come, first-served basis. Moving over to eligibility for organization types, this stream of the electric vehicle charging program is only open for municipalities as per the Municipal Government Act. The only exception to that is nonprofit community-related organizations, or CROs, that are located on municipally owned land. They can participate, but the municipality is required to sign the application and the funding agreement, and funding would be sent to the municipality to then be distributed to that CRO afterwards. Some of you may have noticed an announcement yesterday from Natural Resources Canada and Southgrow in Alberta that there is additional funding coming to the province to be managed by Southgrow, and the Action Centre is looking to be the project manager for that. So that funding would be for businesses and institutions, nonprofits, and Indigenous communities in southern Alberta. Moving on to project requirements, stations need to be installed on municipally owned lands. That could be a facility or an on-street location, and can be intended for public or municipal use. It is up to the municipality to decide, so you can blend public stations and then submit another application for municipal fleet stations as well, as long as it fits within all the criteria and within your $200,000 funding maximum. Stations must be permanent, they must be new, and they must be fully owned and operated by the municipality. They must be networked chargers approved for use in Canada. And when I say networked, what I'm referring to is that the station has the ability to connect to the internet through a cellular or wireless signal. And that just helps bring additional benefits to the municipality as the station owner, because you can report on real-time charging status. You can charge a usage fee and collect that fee through the platform and through the network. You can download software updates and remote troubleshoot and a variety of other benefits as well. Stations must be installed by a fully licensed electrical contractor, and they must be have a dedicated parking space per connector. Getting into what would not be eligible as a project is any EV charging infrastructure installed prior to receiving approval and signing a funding agreement. So the program will not be funding any retroactive projects. So we just really encourage municipalities to not sign any contracts, do not order any equipment or complete the project prior to not only submitting the application, but receiving a duly signed funding agreement between both the municipality and the Action Center. Non-networked stations will not be eligible. Any replacement of existing charging infrastructure will not be eligible, and any stations for non-passenger vehicle chargers will also not be eligible. Keeping with eligibility, but shifting over to the expense side of things, the program will be covering costs for equipment and materials, any consumable materials. So that would include obviously the charging equipment, but also the conduit, the cables, any breakers that need to be added, and so forth. We'd be covering the installation and construction costs. So that would include labor, any equipment rentals if there needs to be equipment rented to help with trenching, all of those types of things. Engineering and design costs, but we're asking that if any engineering and design costs are included in your project, just that we receive a detailed rationale and scope of work just to ensure that that's appropriate for your scale of project. And permitting and inspection costs, and any site signage, parking space painting, or any physical barriers to protect the stations from either vandalism or any accidental damage. In terms of ineligible expenses, we will not be covering any taxes, GST, land, or legal costs. We will not be covering any ongoing operations or any maintenance costs. So that would include any electricity consumption, electrical demand charges, or networking fees. In-house labor and administrative costs relating to submitting program documents is also not eligible. Any electrical service upgrades upstream of the service, if required, are not eligible as well. So that would include bringing power into a site if you don't have power at that site, any transformer upgrades, any distribution lines that would need to be brought in, anything like that. And that's particularly notable for level 3 stations. So again, the site selection is very important. So if you don't have phase 3 power at a site, you may want to look at a different site for a level 3 station, or municipalities are free to incur the costs to upgrade the electrical service upstream at their own expense, and then go through the program for the level 3 install and equipment costs. But at that point, if we're looking at the overall project, we obviously wouldn't be covering 100% of all the costs a municipality incurs. And then finally, any site or electrical demand assessments. Generally, those are things that would take place prior to the application being submitted and would also not be eligible. So really high level, there's a lot of things to consider when you're planning an EV charging station project. These are just a few that I wanted to highlight. We will be sharing an install and operations guide. It's just in development right now, hoping to have that in the next couple weeks that will dive into all sorts of considerations, which should help when planning a project. But like I said throughout, it's important to consider site selection and the availability of phase 3 power if you're looking at level 3 stations. Again, nearby amenities and visibility also very important. Charging usage fees for public stations is also something a municipality should consider in terms of recouping costs, and is actually something we would generally recommend you to implement. At a minimum, it helps you recoup some of those costs, the networking fees, the demand, the electricity, but also creates an incentive for drivers that are charging at that location to move their vehicles. If it's free for use, they may sit there and maybe hog the station for a little bit longer than they should. But if they are paying for use, then there is an incentive to charge the amount that they need and then move on and allow that station to be used by someone else. Also important to understand the ongoing costs. So again, there will be a network fee because all stations need to be networked. Network fees are generally fairly low, in the ballpark of $200 or so per year, but just good to understand that that would be a cost that the municipality would be required to take on themselves. And just that equipment is suitable for outdoor operations and in extreme temperatures. So we'd encourage municipalities looking for stations that are warranted down to minus 40 degrees on the low end, but up to plus 40 degrees on the high end, and just take in local conditions into account, particularly southern Alberta. There's fairly windy conditions, so just making sure that those pedestals are very secure and can handle those wind loads. Moving on to the participation timeline. The first step, we would recommend all municipalities to review the guidebook and all of the resources we have on our website as the first step. Next, you can move on to submitting an expression of interest. That is really a non-committal stage that just gives us some information about your project, enough that we can follow up with you and have a conversation, give you an opportunity to answer or to ask any questions that you have about the process or about the technology, and really help you prepare for the application. After we have that follow-up call, you'd be free to submit the application. It's available on our website for download already. The application form is looking for some high-level narrative on the project, what kind of benefits it will bring, some of the site-specific conditions, the quotes, and the specific technology that would be installed. And once all of that is wrapped up, we would receive that from you, along with all of those quotes and those attachments, review that, and as long as everything checks out, we would issue you the funding agreement. If there was ever any issues with your application, it's not your only shot to submit. We would generally give you feedback and request additional information or additional attachments, and then give you the option to resubmit that. So it's not a one-shot pass-fail type approach. After we send the funding agreement, that would just outline all of the terms and conditions, and based on the application, it should give you a good estimate as to what the funding you will receive looks like. Obviously, those things can change, and we can issue amendments as needed to accommodate that, but everything would be detailed in that funding agreement. So you would essentially sign off on that, pass it back to us, we would sign off on it, pass it back to you for your records, and then at that point you would be free to order your equipment, start the install, and at that point we are available for any questions or anything, but it's the municipality's responsibility to complete that project. And the final step would be to submit the completion documents. So that would include proof of payment of the contractors and any equipment providers, and all of the proof of payment for all of the expenses, the final invoices, photos of the equipment being operational, and some public engagement, proof of public engagement documents. So things like a media release, proof of sharing project details on social media, quotes from municipal leaders, and so forth. Once we receive all that, again, we will verify that. If anything's missing, we will reach out to you. If everything has been received, we would then begin processing the rebate for your project and send that over to you. So again, the project or the program is first come, first served. We've received quite a lot of interest so far. So if this is something that you are interested in, we would recommend looking to move quicker than not. Projects must be completed within 12 months of signing a funding agreement. The application deadline is to be determined just based on the average project duration. We're going to be setting an application deadline likely in the next couple months or so. So yeah, stay tuned for that. We'll be sending out a notice to everyone who we've been in contact with. So that's the balance of the EVCP program. I just wanted to cover a couple tools and resources we have available for municipalities. First, starting with our EV savings calculator. So this is actually a tool that anybody can use just by putting in a couple set points on the annual distance that your vehicle travels, a few set points on electricity cost and gasoline cost or fuel cost, and then comparing a particular EV model with a particular internal combustion engine model and comparing the difference in costs, fuel costs, maintenance costs, and greenhouse gas emissions. And within the internal combustion engine side of things, there's actually a custom entry that you can add the fuel economy of any vehicle, whether it's a new internal combustion engine vehicle or old. So there's some customization options there. And then essentially you would hit that compute button and get your results. This is what that would look like. So again, showing the differences between the EV and the ICE vehicle for fuel maintenance costs and those emissions, just to help making decisions. And then we also have our electric vehicle knowledge guide. So we just updated this recently. We'll look to update it a little bit more as we release that install and operations guide that I mentioned earlier. But this is a really great step to learn more about the best practices for deploying EVs within a municipality, looking at the vehicle types from passenger vehicles to low speed to heavy duty vehicles. And some other strategies as well. So this is available on our website and free to download, as it's a good resource for getting up to speed on this emerging field. And that's it for the presentation. So I think we are good to open it up for questions. So it looks like we've received quite a few. We'll try to get through as many as we can.
I can start. The way we'll have this organized is based on the upvoting. So I'll go with the ones that have received the most thumbs up, and then we'll kind of work our way down. The first question is super important. Will the presentation be available to download? Yes, it will. It'll take about 24 to 48 hours for this to come through, and we will post it. We'll send it out via email to all attendees. We will also put it on our website, and it'll be on our YouTube channel as well. So do watch out for that. And I think because there are so many FAQ that we likely can't get through, we'll download all of these questions and we'll make sure that we have replies to them, and then we will send them out with the email and post to the site as well, just to ensure that everyone's got those. Okay, so the question so far that with the most upvotes is for those of us new to this field, are you able to provide a list of dependable vendors who can be approached for quotes for level 2 and 3 chargers?
Yes, good question. I'm not surprised that got the most upvotes. We generally try to, for reliability purposes, not recommend vendors, but We do have just recently updated this morning, because this is a very common question within our EV knowledge guide that I mentioned. We've put together a list of some of the bigger players in this space. I think there's probably 6 or so of those listed. So you're free to go to that list and contact them. It has their phone numbers, email addresses, and links to their websites. We would generally recommend that municipalities get at least a couple quotes just to look at the variety of costs and make sure that they're doing their due diligence and choosing a contractor that fits their needs. So just verbally off the top of my head, that list would include organizations like ChargePoint, Flow, FLO, ABB, Hypercharge, Siemens, and Bosch. But that's just a general list. So we would require the municipality to ensure that the equipment that they are looking to receive from those providers meets program criteria. Some of those providers are more active in the commercial fleet side of EV charging than others. Others, particularly from what I can tell, Siemens and Bosch seem to play a little bit more in the residential side of things, which are not generally networked stations, which are just not as applicable for our program. So I hope that helps.
Amazing, thanks, Calvin. Next question, what is the average estimated cost to install a single station?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I hate to be the it depends guy, but I kind of have to be the it depends guy. So yeah, it really depends on the specific site and the type of station. So there's a pretty significant cost difference between level 2 and level 3. If we're just talking level 2, again, it depends, how close or how far your station is from the electrical panel. Obviously, there's more trenching involved, more cable, more material, and so forth. But installs can really vary anywhere, maybe on the low end, about $7,000 for both the equipment and the install, maybe as high as about $20,000. So yeah, there's a lot of variation there. On the level 3 side of things, there's even more variation because you saw in the funding table there the variety of charging outputs and the costs that goes along with those, again, really varies, but can be, I guess for a 50 kilowatt station, can be maybe as low as about 80,000 to as high as about 120,000. So you can see there's a pretty significant jump between the two. And at least from our perspective, we're anticipating that the program will fund more level 2 stations than level 3.
Thanks, Calvin. Shoot. Sorry, I lost track. Can we install a level 2 inside our ICE arena for future electric Zamboni? Current one is gas powered.
So no, that would not be eligible, but that's actually not, well, it would not be eligible because all of this funding is intended for passenger vehicles, not low speed vehicles, not heavy duty vehicles or anything like that. So that's kind of the first condition. But electric ICE resurfacers actually use a totally different type of charging solution. It is not level 2. It is actually quite different than everything that we've talked about today. So no, that would be separate. But if you want to reach out to us about our electric vehicle for municipalities program, we've funded quite a few electric ICE resurfacers in the past and could definitely talk about that.
Fantastic. I think you may have answered this already, but what is the average cost of a level 3 charger or level 4 charger?
Well, I don't believe there is a level 4 charger. Maybe Elon Musk will come up with something here soon. But Yeah, level 3 chargers will vary, again, just depending on the site-specific conditions, and that project will also really vary whether or not that site has phase 3 power already or not. But it can really, it can range from about 80,000 to about 120,000. But with costs these days, I think I would defer to the equipment providers for more exact figures on that question.
Okay, great. Next question. This is from Rob. The abstract need for adapters is a barrier to entry for prospective EV owners because it seems complicated. As far as I understand, the EU has standardized CCS as the plug that must be used by all EV manufacturers and chargers. Should we be pushing for the same standardization in Canada?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's kind of like any, format of new technology. Like I kind of think back to like DVD, like HD DVD versus Blu-ray and things, right? At least my opinion, it seems as though CCS is kind of already winning against particularly the CHAdeMO plug type. So yeah, I think standardization would really help, but at least with our program, level 3 stations need to have one of each. So that way, it doesn't matter as much for someone who can only charge on a CHAdeMO or can only charge on a CCS. They have that option. So yeah, I think standardization would help, but I feel like we're kind of trending towards there being, I want to say one clear winner, but I mean, we're not really, not quite there yet because Tesla is still kind of in the game as well, right? But I think we're trending towards that.
Fantastic. Another really great question from Leslie. Would you prefer, oh no, sorry, we got down, here we go. Sorry, this is from Charlene. Is there access to information regarding the ongoing costs, which then would impact the charging usage fees?
Yeah, well, it's difficult for us to estimate that. Let's just use level 2, for example, because your rate for electricity and demand will be variable depending on who your retailer is. So it's challenging for us to estimate that, but for at least on the network fee side of things, we know it's a fairly modest annual fee. But from what I've heard from folks that have already installed stations outside of the program, is that at least in their examples, their cost of electricity is in the ballpark with demand is in the ballpark of 50 to 75 cents per kilowatt hour, and they're charging about $2 an hour, so it generally recoups a good chunk of the cost. So I hope that helps, but it would be up to your own rates, which would vary between municipalities.
Alrighty. Next question. Do we have to cover install cost upfront and get reimbursed on project completion?
Yes, that is right. All costs would need to be covered upfront because it is a rebate-based program. And we just ask that all of those costs are included in the application and are approved within the funding agreement. And then, yes, we would be distributing the rebate after we can verify that the project was completed as intended.
Excellent. From Leslie, would you prefer a single application per municipality? I understand funding will be issued at a first come first serve basis. While why not prioritize funding for priority areas or service gaps?
Yeah, well, I guess to answer the first part of that question, I can't find it. There's many in here, but I think she was asking kind of, can we submit more than one application, or is the preference to bundle everything together? And we don't necessarily have a preference in that regard. If there are reasons that would lead the municipality to look to separate applications and have separate projects dictated by separate funding agreements, we can accommodate that. But if you'd like to bundle everything in, we can also accommodate that. The condition is that if you have, like, let's just say, for example's sake, 10 stations within one funding agreement and one application, we will not be distributing that rebate until every single station can be verified as complete. So if there was ever one small condition on one site that was kind of delaying that one project or that one component of the project from being complete, that would hold up your rebate. So those are just some things to consider. And I might, Kara, can you just read the second part of that question again? Thanks.
Oh, yes, here, hold on. Sorry, just scrolling up here.
They're shifting all over, yeah.
Would you prefer a single application per municipality? Second part was, I understand funding will be issued at first come, first served. Why not prioritize funding for priority areas or service gap areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. But generally, the kind of state of charging in the province right now is that we need more charging opportunities everywhere. There's obviously some areas that we need it a little bit more, and we will be reaching out to those municipalities and really encouraging them to get involved, and particularly hoping that they see the value in being a level 3 station site host. But across the province, we need more charging opportunities, even level 2 in public locations for folks who have no access to a garage or anywhere else to charge. So with that, we felt as though we would leave it first come, first served. And so far, I think a lot of municipalities that are in kind of in the middle of those gap areas recognize the opportunity that they have to fill the need there and are already in touch with us.
All right, thanks, Calvin. Okay, this is a two-part question as well from Mike. Does funding arrive before install, after agreement signed, or does the municipality have to pay and submit receipts for reimbursement? And the second part is the funding scoped to a level that it should actually cover all costs for level 2 chargers?
Yeah, so for the first part, again, it's a rebate-based program, so the municipality will need to pay all expenses and provide proof of payment for those expenses to us during the verification and the project completion phase. And then we will be issuing that rebate. One thing I didn't mention in the presentation is that given we're sourcing the funding at 50% from the government of Alberta, which is funding we already have, and 50% from NRCan, the distribution of the rebates may take a little bit longer than some folks may be used to with us. We're generally very quick after a project has been complete. So it could be in the ballpark of 1 to 4 or 5 months after the project is complete, just depending on when that falls. That's an NRCan kind of condition. But yes, it's all a rebate system. And then again, sorry, I think I missed the second part.
Second part is the funding scoped to a level that it should actually cover all costs for level 2 chargers? Yes,
great question. It's difficult to answer because, again, there's so much variability in your specific site. But yes, we tried to do the best we could in that. Really, what we're doing with our rebate is doubling NRCan's values, and from what I can tell, they are fairly close to what it would actually cost to install those stations. Good question.
Very good question. And next up, how long do EV chargers last on average? Do you expect that technology will change and the charger will need to be updated or replaced with new technology in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. In terms of how long they will last, it kind of relates to the same standardization question that was asked previously. The plug type, we're far enough along that I don't think, the plug types that we talked about today, maybe aside from the Chatamo plug, will become obsolete anytime soon. So I think we're good there. But in terms of how long the stations last, again, it would kind of depend on how they were installed. If they were maybe a little bit more prone to accidents and things, and it really also like cable management kind of comes into play, right? Like, do you have a system in place for cable management? That's something that's typically can see some wear and tear because it's always being pulled down and then plugged into the vehicle. But generally, we would expect the stations to last, at least, certainly at least 5 years, if not, probably 5 to 10 years. After that, there could still be a good number of them in operation, but the network operators might want or might encourage folks to upgrade or so forth. But one of the things that's important to consider with these installs is that if in 10 or 12 or 15 years the station may be up for replacement, you already have a lot of that infrastructure in the ground, like the cable trenching and everything. So your costs would certainly be lower because you may only look to replace the station, and there's a lot of other work that you've already done that would not need to be replaced.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Calvin. Next question. Do you have any signage or simple education materials for projects?
Education materials, yes. I referenced the EV knowledge guide, and that will be coming out with another install and operations guide. That's a good point. Maybe we can put a couple examples of signage in some of those guides, just to kind of prompt ideas and give an example. But no, we don't have any examples of signage right now. But if you were to even go on the plugshare.com website and look at a couple example stations, generally there's pictures of stations on the website, and you can see what kind of signage they are using as an example as well.
Alrighty, another good question here. What is the typical rate for charging a vehicle, and how many vehicles would you need to charge over the period of 1 month to cover the monthly costs incurred by the charger? For example, what is the break even?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like I can only really answer the first part of it. So the average rates, at least for level 2, are in the ballpark of $1.50 to $2 an hour. Municipalities are free to charge that. Yeah, no problem there. In terms of the break-even point, it really depends on I guess, both if we're talking level 2, which that break-even point might be quite a bit easier to achieve compared to level 3. At least level 3, the average rates, it varies as well, anywhere from about $15 per hour to about 20, maybe as high as 25, but not as common there. Is generally actually charged per minute. I think it averages out to about 30 or 35 cents a minute. Yeah, your break-even point will really depend on what your demand structure looks like, and what your rates look like. That's going to be different, kind of depending on what part of the province you are in, whether you're in kind of ATCO or Fortis or EPCOR or NMAX territory, and kind of what your demand structure looks like. So I don't think I can necessarily answer that.
Thanks, Calvin. Really good question from Michelle here. We have municipal property on which to install, but a local business would supply power. Does power need to be supplied by municipality, or is that not relevant to the project?
Yeah, actually, this is a good question that came up in an expression of interest call. And I didn't exactly have an answer at first, but when I thought about it a little bit more, it is the municipality's responsibility to provide power to this station 24/7. And we could get into a little bit more of the details and terms and conditions within the funding agreement that would speak to this. But if they are essentially pulling power from a business, you don't necessarily have that control, because anything could happen to that business. They could go out of business and vacate that location and not want to incur any costs. The building owner may not want to incur any costs as a result and turn off the power to the station. And that is not something that we want. It would just provide a poor experience for an EV driver that would pull up there. So yeah, I would lean toward that, unfortunately, not being eligible, because the level of control is kind of outside of the municipality's hands at that point.
Thanks, Calvin. Alrighty, here's another good one. What is the typical rate for charging a vehicle, and how many vehicles would you need to charge? Oh, we already answered that one. Sorry. Funding is capped at $200,000 per municipality. What is the rationale for this cap? The funding source is taxpayer dollars, so why wouldn't larger municipalities like Edmonton be eligible for more funding than small municipalities? Edmonton citizens would have contributed more tax dollars than smaller municipalities. The funding cap should be based on a municipality's population.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. To be frank, we don't have a lot of flexibility in that that cap, because that's actually something that NRCan has imposed on third-party delivery agents of their funding, like the MCCAC, and we have just doubled it with some funding that we have through the government of Alberta. But I do see your point. But I think it is important to consider that, if we look at Alberta as a network, we need to fill in gaps to the overall network to achieve our overall goals of getting more EVs on the road. And I totally understand that that's, Edmontonians and Calgarians make up a big piece of the EV adoption pie in the province right now, and that there should be charging opportunities for them. Certainly understand that point and agree there. But we should view it as a network and should provide equal opportunity for other municipalities and organizations across the network to fill in those gaps. Particularly to the big cities, they are, at least in Calgary's case, accessing additional funding through NRCan to build out more stations. I'm not sure if that's something that's in the works for the city of Edmonton, but yeah, they are receiving additional funding on top of what they could receive through our program. So I hope that helps to build out their local networks as well.
Alrighty, next question. Can CROs install on non-municipal property, for example, community centers?
Unfortunately, they cannot, at least not through this program. It does need to be municipally owned land, and I understand there's kind of differences in the way some municipalities may own the land of community halls and community leagues and the community associations, and then others may not, particularly in the difference there being kind of in Calgary and Edmonton. So unfortunately, it needs to be municipally owned land. That being said, I did mention the South Grow program that will be coming here in the next little bit. That program will be reserved for groups in Southern Alberta, which could include nonprofit organizations. There will be a priority window for groups in Southern Alberta to pursue that funding. And if any funding is remaining, that would open up province-wide. So that could be another solution for nonprofit organizations that do own their own land.
Thanks, Calvin. Next question, who are the network providers and how much are the monthly network fees?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of variety, but generally the big players like Flow and ChargePoint, they are also network operators, so they manufacture the equipment and they will manage the network for you. I can't speak to the differences with some of the other manufacturers. They may have a different network provider, but those fees, again, they're going to be variable. And I don't know to what extent they've kind of increased over the past, 12 months or so. But they are generally in the ballpark of, $150 to about $250 per year. And that's particular to level 2 stations. I don't, to be honest, I don't know to what extent the rates are very different for level 3 stations. They may be slightly higher, but generally it's not seen to be a very significant ongoing cost.
Fantastic. Another great question. Can municipalities combine funding from EVCP with other funding sources?
Yes, this is a good question. You can. So again, the funding comes from the Government of Alberta and Natural Resources Canada through the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or ZEVIP. So in the scenario where our funding does not cover 100% of your eligible costs, let's just say, for example's sake, we cover 75, you could look for other funders to make up the remaining 25%. Obviously, we don't want any projects to be funded over 100% of costs, but you could look to do that. The exception being that you cannot receive that funding from the ZEVIP program because our 50% of our funding is already coming from the ZEVIP program. But if there was some other funding opportunity kind of outside the federal government or the provincial government to make up that 25%, yeah, that is something that you could pursue.
Excellent. I've got a bunch of 4s here, and we have about 2 minutes left. So I will go with, what is the goal of this program? Are you trying to get municipal fleets to be all EVs, or are you trying to get charge banks at municipal recreation facilities for the public?
Yeah, we had a slide on that earlier in the presentation, and both of those are our goals. I feel as though we would prefer a little bit more build out on the public infrastructure side of things. But that being said, yeah, if municipalities, you can mix and match, right? So if you want to spend, or if you want to use your, you have 200,000 that is your maximum, you want to use 100,000 of that towards a public station, and then 100,000 of that towards your own municipal fleet, you can do that. But yes, those are goals to build out the network, shrink some of those gaps, provide opportunities for folks who don't have at-home charging solutions to charge as well, and generally just try to support the adoption of EVs across the entire province, whether that's for private residents or municipal fleets.
Okay, so this will be our last one, which is actually more of a comment than it is a question. It says, there are small tourist/recreation-based municipalities that serve huge visitor numbers who don't contribute to the tax base. We appreciate the equal footing for funding. Otherwise, we will never be able to afford such installations.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, that's a good kind of counter to one of the other questions. Yeah, we've even seen with previous projects that, kind of eco-tourism or EV tourism is a thing that's kind of developing in Alberta and even in BC as well. So if we can help people get to those tourist destinations and travel onwards from them with this infrastructure, then that's great. That's great for both the economies of both BC and Alberta, and yeah, great to see.
Excellent. So that concludes questions, but I do just want to have one before we close here. Is first come, first serve based on EOI submissions or application submission?
Yeah, good question. It is actually on the funding agreements being signed, because nothing is locked in until that funding agreement is signed. So yeah, again, once your funding agreement is signed, we know roughly what your expected rebate will be, and we are reserving that for your project. So that once that value essentially hits zero, we can't take on any more projects. So yeah, again, just want to reiterate that no equipment or anything should be ordered, no construction started or anything like that until that funding agreement is signed, because that is really the deciding factor.
Amazing. I think we will close with that because we've got dozens more questions to actually be answered. But what we will do is we will pull these off and we will include them in an FAQ document that we will send out with an email to all of you folks so that we know that they are answered and you have them in hand when you are ready to submit your EOI.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining, and yeah, I hope you found this valuable. Thanks.
Thanks.